Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today we're going to be talking about Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné. This is the Elric Saga Volume 1. That's the first 4 books of Elric. Let's get into it. Alright, Jordan here. So let's begin with a little overview of this series, and in particular I want to talk about the main character, the unforgettable Elric of Melniboné. It is the color of a bleached skull, his flesh, and the long hair which flows below his shoulders is milk white. From the tapering, beautiful head stare 2 slanting eyes, crimson and moody, and from the loose sleeves of his yellow gown emerge 2 slender hands, also the color of bone, resting on each arm of a seat which has been carved from a single massive ruby. The crimson eyes are troubled, and sometimes one hand will rise to finger the light helm which sits upon the white locks, a helm made from some dark greenish alloy and exquisitely molded into the likeness of a dragon about to take wing. On the hand there is a ring in which is set a single rare actorious stone whose core sometimes shifts sluggishly and reshapes itself as if it were sentient smoke. He looks down the long flight of quartz steps to where his court disports itself, dancing with such delicacy and whispering grace that it might be a court of ghosts. Mentally, he debates moral issues, and in itself this activity divides him from the great majority of his subjects, for these people are not human. Thus sits Elric at the start of Book 1, Elric the 8th of his name, son of Sadric the 86th, 428th Sorcerer Emperor of the stagnating but beautiful island civilization of Melniboné. One of the most unique characters in fantasy literature, Elric is a reluctant ruler. An accomplished scholar and sorcerer, he is introspective, much preferring the life of the mind, the life of books and learning. Anemic and physically frail from birth, with deficient blood, he must take a cocktail of sorcerous drugs and rare herbs to function and stay alive. But more than anything, Elric is afflicted with a conscience, a fact which sets him apart from the vast majority of his subjects and the nobles who surround him and vie for power. No one wishes to usurp the throne more than his villainous cousin Irkun, who is next in line of succession. A cruel, deeply ambitious sorcerer, Irkun believes in the old ways of Melniboné and will do anything to knock Elric off the throne and restore the Dragon Isle and its capital, Imrir, the Dreaming City, to its former glory and imperial might. Because of Elric's introspective self-loathing and hatred of Melnibonéan traditions, his subjects find him odd and unfathomable. Irkun interprets this behavior as weakness and plots the albino's death. Yet Irkun may have a point. To survive, Melniboné may have to restore its traditions and unite under the banner of its ancient ways and customs. For Melniboné, which once ruled the known world, is now a declining power with a decadent culture, lost in sensual pleasures and dreaming, and the surrounding nations, the young kingdoms, now pose a growing threat. Ordinarily, not even Elric's ethical hang-ups would stop him from killing or severely punishing his treacherous cousin, yet the situation is complicated, for Elric is in love with Irkun's sister, Cimmeril, and moreover, Elric may need Irkun, especially because the young kingdoms are busy planning an attack of their own. But that is only the beginning of the story. In the novels that follow, we embark upon an epic philosophical adventure of ambition, love, loss, revenge, and discovery. A journey across the known world and through dreamlands as our champion Elric searches for the truth with the help of friends and foes, gods and demons, and his iconic weapon, Stormbringer, the demonic red-runed soul-sucking black sword that seems to possess a mind and will of its own. Alright, so just a little synopsis there. Let's start with some context. The Elric Saga is a series of sword and sorcery stories by the British author Michael Moorcock. that take place in an alternate or possibly prehistoric Earth setting. And all of this is just one small part of Moorcock's larger multiverse. I'm just going to follow the internal chronology here because Moorcock started writing the Elric stories in the 1960s with novellas and short stories, and then he added stories in the 70s through into the 90s and the aughts, and he just published another book of stories. The guy is actually still alive, but if you want to read the saga along with me, there's actually a reading order that goes like this. Book 1 was published in 1972, and it's called Elric of Melniboné, and this is like a prequel to the whole saga moving forward. Book 2 is Fortress of the Pearl. Book 3 is Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and Book 4 is The Weird of the White Wolf. And so these 4 books are collected in the Elric Saga, Volume 1, and it has a foreword by Neil Gaiman. The next 4 books are collected in Volume 2, which is called Stormbringer, and if you want the next 3 books, you'll have to pick up this massive tome called The White Wolf. And then if you still haven't had enough, as I said, they put out a 4th volume this year, which I do not yet own. These are, thankfully, the new omnibus editions published by Saga Press that use the preferred text in the preferred order. They're hardcover. Each volume comes with beautiful exquisite paintings with a lovely typeface, and what's great is that if you're an audiobook person, they've even put out audio editions for each of these books, so definitely check those out. So before we get into what I liked and what I didn't, I want to give you guys a sense of these 4 books that are compiled in this first volume 1, so you can decide whether or not this series is for you. So I already basically did a summary for book 1, Elric of Melniboné. The first book really just introduces you to the setting and the main characters and the gods, sets you up with the love interest and a few antagonists, and then it plays out a really entertaining and dramatic story that serves as the pretext for Elric going on this epic adventure, which really spans the latter 3 books. Book 2 in here is called Fortress of the Pearl, and it starts out in the city of Quarzahat at the edge of the Sighing Desert, where Elric is tasked with finding a treasure known as the Pearl at the heart of the world, and he has to find it fast because he's been given a slow-acting poison by a very unsavory but powerful person in this world, and the only way to get the antidote is to return the pearl before the poison kills him. Another kicker is that to get the pearl, Elric has to essentially journey through the dreams of a young holy girl who is in like a sleeping beauty coma, and so to do this he has to take a guide who is the beautiful and beguiling dream thief Una to help him navigate the 7 dreamlands. So this one's definitely a strange, I want to say almost experimental book. Parts of it reminded me of that that film with Robin Williams, What Dreams May Come, and it's also definitely got a kind of trippy Sandman vibe as well, and you'll see what I mean when you read it. Most of the book is set in the world of dreams, and so for the most part, Elric is dream surfing, and it can get, as I said, pretty trippy at times, though the plot, I would say, remains coherent. So while I gave book 1 a 5 out of 5. The second book in here, Fortress of the Pearl, I'm giving that a 3.6 out of 5. There are times when your mind is going to be blown and you're really going to be caught up in the story, and times when your head is going to be spinning and you'll just be wondering what the hell are the rules around here, what's actually even happening. So kind of a head scratcher, book number 2, but there are a lot of interesting things in that one. Book 3 in here is called Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and this continues the journey. Elric has left Quarzahat, but he's being hunted, and so he escapes on this mysterious ship sailed by a blind captain, where he sails the seas of time and fate, and he has his first encounter with other manifestations of the Moorcockian figure of the Eternal Champion. Again, the Eternal Champion is this archetype of the doomed hero bound to a supernatural weapon who is fated to fight on the side of law or chaos to maintain the whole balance between the two forces. And so these 4 champions have to go to this island and battle a pair pair of sorcerers, and then what follows is a sort of very conventional high fantasy story. It's largely action. The whole thing has got this very Ray Harryhausen, Jason and the Argonauts, Sinbad the Sailor sort of feel to it that I actually really appreciated there in book 3. So I gave book 3 a 3.8 out of 5. It had something classic and kind of pulpy and very kind of high sword and sorcery that I really liked about it. So lastly, book 4, this is the 4th novel that is compiled in here. It's called The Weird of the White Wolf. So this volume includes the first 2 Elric stories ever published, and it's actually a collection of 4 stories, The Weird of the White Wolf. So you have The Dreaming City, While the Gods Laugh, The Singing Citadel, and The Dream of Earl Aubeck. And I won't say anything more about those crazy stories, and they do get crazy because I'm already summarizing too much of this whole thing. I gave the last book a 3.6 out of 5, just like the second one. All right, so now that you know what the books compiled in this volume are about, the next question is Elric for you? So I'll put it this way. Elric is essentially Conan the Barbarian meets Dark Elf Trilogy meets the Neverending Story. So it's Conan the Barbarian in terms of the sword and sorcery elements, the sense of a ruler also being a warrior and going around and slaying people in the name of his own sense of justice. The fact also that the story is told as a series of short stories and novellas, which is pretty old school. So you've got all of that. It's got a dark elf vibe too, in that Elric, like Drizzt, feels like he's an ethical person in an immoral world. He feels like an outsider, really, for being a deep thinker and a sincere, sort of morally serious person in a world filled with irony and cynicism. And it's also got a never-ending story vibe, too, in the sense that the world building is very kind of fantastical in this kind of 1980s way almost. It's filled with all these weird people and creatures and strange places of the imagination, and pretty much every story Elric is tasked with going to one of these places and accomplishing some traditional fantasy mission there. So it's like, Elric has to navigate the boiling seas with the ship that sails on land to save the princess, or he has to go to the sighing desert to find the pearl at the heart of the world by dream walking through the dreams of this holy girl. You see what I mean, right? So let's now get into what I liked and what I didn't like about this book. What I liked, I just want to say that while Elric is not the best fantasy I've ever read, it's not everything I hoped it would be for a variety of reasons. It definitely fulfilled a very specific niche that few other authors have been able to fill for me. It uses traditional aesthetics and combines those with a kind of new wave philosophy. So it's totally original in its conception and its vision, but also clearly inspired by a plethora of traditional myths and fairy tales and early foundational fantasy authors like Mervyn Peake and J.R.R. Tolkien, even if Moorcock sees himself as some kind of anti-Tolkien. And just to add to that, for as subversive as the Elric Saga is supposed to be, the story is actually beautifully wrought and very much has the elements that you would expect from traditional fantasy. Elric has to kill the bad guy, save his kingdom, preserve the old traditions for a new age, save the princess, literally. And while the series does go off in a different direction and definitely becomes less traditional, that underlying core foundation definitely remains there, whether Moorcock intended it to be there or not. Here's another thing I liked, just the character of Elric himself. What a unique fantasy creation Elric is. The fact that the hero of a fantasy series is this tall, lanky, albino, Johnny Winter-looking sorcerer with red eyes and a sword that's semi-conscious. The fact that Elric is this broody, introspective, self-aware, and at times misguided and very flawed person who is morally conscious to the point, I would say, of being naively idealistic. I just think that makes for a really interesting fantasy hero. Elric is the kind of good guy who realizes the bad guy has a point sometimes, and is aware of the fact that he hates his rival Irkun because Irkun knows him for what he is. I love the fact that Moorcock shows the world and human nature as being fundamentally at odds with Elric's philosophy. And what's funny is that in interviews, Moorcock makes it seem like, you know, his books are a representation of his own philosophy. And yet, from what I can tell, much of what I'm reading here is way more nuanced and self-aware than all of that. He seems to be aware that Elric's ideas butt up against reality a lot of times, and that his character is fundamentally poetic, right, rather than mimetic. There's a conflict between his will and his facticity, to use the existential term. And you can see that in how other characters react to him in the story. In most fantasy stories, the hero is a sort of just, noble, athletic everyman whose life has somehow been unfair to him. He's poor, he's lost a parent, he lives under a cruel, oppressive regime. It's kind of the opposite with Elric. Elric is not down on his luck. He's one of the most powerful individuals in the world. He's a noble ruler, and he's definitely not an everyman or like some athletic, buff, jock guy, right? Elric is a sickly, bookish, cerebral, intellectual sorcerer who spent his childhood reading all the books in his palace's immense library. He's a dreamer, and you can see this in the fact that Elric is much less concerned with what is in front of him and much more concerned constantly with what's happening in the larger world outside of his own kingdom, which lends him a very modern sensibility. So many young people that you meet today, for example, have no interest in local politics. They might not even know who the mayor or council person is, or who makes the zoning laws, or who sits on the school board. They may not even know their neighbors. Increasingly, modern people will live next to someone for 10 years, and when you ask them, they'll tell you that they've never even spoken to their neighbors. They go to the grocery store, they put their headphones in, and won't speak to anyone or make eye contact, and yet they're very sort of connected to the wider world. They have all of these abstract concerns about policies that are passed at the national level and national elections, and something happens in California or Texas and they're super concerned about it, and it's like they're not even really paying attention to what's in front of them or what's happening at the local level, but something happens halfway around the world, and that becomes the sort of the new thing. And Elric is exactly like this. Elric thinks in philosophical abstractions. He has his eye on making the world a better, more just place according to his own vision, while really abandoning his own community. He's the kind of individual who thinks he's a good person because he has the right worldview. And you get a sense that he feels what makes people good is, do they have the right beliefs and values? And yet for the vast majority of human history, we've defined people as good by virtue of what they do, how they act, how they treat the people in front of them. Are they a good leader? Do they raise good children? Do they devote themselves to improving their communities and being good role models? Do they take responsibility for their actions? Do they clean up after themselves? Are they good neighbors? Are they being a burden on others, or are they helping others? Yet for Elric, he sees himself as a good person because he has a certain ideology. And so he does feel incredibly real and modern. And this is honestly probably why so many people are turned off by this series. Not everyone wants their fantasy hero to be a whiny, complicated, disenchanted, meta-ironic figure with the ideology of an angsty yet intelligent 16-year-old boy. It's probably also that the author has said some rather unsavory things about Tolkien and his worldview, and yet, here are my feelings. We can disagree with Michael Moorcock while acknowledging that he has created a truly magnificent character in Elric. And that's why I'm putting this under things I like. Not all fantasy characters need to be Frodo or Sam or Aragorn or Gandalf. Sometimes I want a character to be more like Simon from Tad Williams' Dragonbone Chair, or Jorg from Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns. Tad Williams, by the way, said that Moorcock is a giant and that he single-handedly changed the genre of fantasy. Jason Sheehan from NPR puts it this way: Elric, he says, is far and away the coolest, grimmest, moodiest, most elegant, degenerate, drug-addicted, cursed, twisted, and emotionally weird mass murderer of them all. And he is emotionally weird, and I disagree with much of Elric's own outlook. But I like to read philosophical fantasy, and I like to see a character grappling with their own morality and with their own worldview. I like that psychomachia, that sense that ideas have consequences, right? And that a fantasy hero should be more than just a, swashbuckler. But the other thing, too, is that while Elric departs from Tolkien's vision in Lord of the Rings, I think it's a mistake to reduce him just to the status of one of these modern anti-heroes. He's more complex than that. He is human, all too human, right? In the first book, the narrator says that Elric's reading has, quote, taught him to question the uses to which power is put, to question his own motives, to question whether his own power should be used at all, in any cause. His reading has led him to this morality, which still he barely understands. So here we have a ruler who is not just a confident, entitled noble with this royal bearing, but someone who's trying to fit into his new role as Emperor of Melniboné. He's trying to be the ruler that his father was. He's trying to be the ruler that his people want him to be. But at the same time, he admits that he feels like he's a, quote, unthinking extension of his ancestors, the puppet of ghosts and memories, dancing to strings which extend back through time for 10,000 years. And so Elric can't help himself. He's a neo-terrorist, and he has this dilemma. Should he try to fit in better and act according to the traditions and customs of his ancestors, or should he heed his own conscience and his moral beliefs and his larger ideas of justice, which he learned from his reading? And there's this tension, too, because Elric is ridiculously merciful. He is way too merciful, especially in the eyes of his detractors. But for Elric, it's not out of cowardice or stupidity. It's on principle. He has these larger abstract ideas of justice that he's learned from his studies, and we get to watch him struggle with the tension between what he thinks is right in the abstract and how the world actually is in reality. And again, it'd be one thing if he was simply a naive brat about all of this. It'd be one thing if he did all of this unthinkingly, but the fact is that Elric is painfully, aware of his own self-inflicted alienation and aware of the fact that he is like a combination of Hamlet and some emo teenager writing in a journal. And here is a quote from the beginning of Book 3, Sailor on the Seas of Fate. Here it is. As he stood beside a bleak sea, feeling trapped and already defeated, he knew himself to be alone in a malevolent universe, bereft of friends and purpose, a useless, sickly anachronism, a fool brought low by his own insufficiencies of character, by his profound inability to believe wholly in the rightness or wrongness of anything at all. He lacked faith in his race, in his birthright, in gods or men, and above all, he lacked faith in himself. And so that's fascinating. It's kind of fascinating that Elric has these flaws, and yet he also gets it. And yet, even though he gets it, he still can't just cosplay the version of himself that people want him to be. In this way, I would argue, and have argued, Elric is the first modern man in all of fantasy literature. Elric is the first sort of person who has the complex of a modern, disenchanted man. It's like that Wordsworth poem, "The world is too much with us." So it goes, "The world is too much with us late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers." And so the speaker here is saying that we've reached this place in history when we are no longer these enchanted beings who see the world as this big, magical, majestic place. Getting and spending is what defines the modern condition, and we've lost some kind of grace that we once possessed. The speaker continues, "Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon. The wind that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we're out of tune. It moves us not." So that's our modern condition, right? Little we see in nature that is ours. All this beautiful majesty happening around us, the sea, the moon, the howling winds, the flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. So that's Elric. He is a disenchanted modern man. He's self-conscious. He's stuck in his head. He doesn't have that automatic, unself-conscious grace, that ancestral memory, right? He no longer shares in that metaphysical dream that Weaver talks about. The world is no longer enchanted, and he is no longer a part of that world. He's outside of it. Wordsworth goes on in his poem. "Great God," he says, "I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so my eye standing on this pleasant lay, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn." So Wordsworth is saying here that he'd rather be an ignorant person living in a different time with beliefs that may be wrong or that may be nonsensical, rather than a disenchanted, atomized, modern, navel-gazing, atheistic man. At least when he looks out at the sea, he'll see the gods, he'll believe that the cosmic order reflects the moral order. And so Wordsworth's speaker in that poem is Elric in a lot of ways, except that unlike Wordsworth, who lived through the French Revolution and wrote this in the early 19th century and took this opportunity to become more religious and to re-enchant the world for himself through Christianity, Elric can't do this. He can't put the genie back in the bottle. And this reminds me, I was recently reading Mary Gordon's introduction to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which is a real, post-World War I modernist manifesto. And there's a similar idea there, and this is Mary Gordon paraphrasing Woolf. "We who live after the First World War," she writes, "have lost something beautiful, some necessary grace. We do not hum under our breaths. We are cats without tails. We are encumbered by our anger, our sense of doom, more important perhaps, by our sexual self-consciousness." And so this is Elric, except Elric is not even as wise, because Elric is a utopian. He thinks he can re-enchant the world with reason and humanism. He's a meliorist, and he even shares his utopian dream with us in the middle of book 1. And here he's describing his secular vision of the most perfect and just court, the court of the future. It's like something Gene Roddenberry would have dreamt up. The narrator says, "His dreams were formal and familiar. Yet this was not the court which emperors of Melniboné had kept for thousands of years of their rule. This was a court to which had come men and women of all nations, from each of the young kingdoms, from Elware and the unmapped east, from Foum, from Quarzahat even. Here information and philosophies were exchanged, together with all manner of goods. This was a court whose energies were not devoted to maintaining itself unchanged for eternity, but to every kind of new idea and lively humane discussion, which welcomed fresh thought not as a threat to its existence, but as a very necessity to its continued well-being, whose wealth was devoted to experiment in the arts and sciences, to supporting those who were needy, to aiding thinkers and scholars. The bright empire's brightness would come no longer from the glow of putrefaction, but from the light of reason and goodwill. This was Elric's dream. This was his dream, and it was why he traveled the world, why he refused the power which was his. why he risked his life, his mind, his love, and everything else he valued, for he believed that there was no life worth living that was not risked in pursuit of knowledge and justice. And this was why his fellow countrymen feared him. One must give up power if one was to achieve true justice. This was not the logic of empire, but it was the logic of one who truly loved the world and desired to see an age dawn when all people would be free to pursue their ambitions in dignity and self-respect. So that is Elric's vision. He's going to usher in a secular, diverse, humanist utopian world that operates according to the lyrics of John Lennon's Imagine, right? Imagine there's no heaven, just sky. Imagine there are no countries. People will just come together and trade ideas in peace in my little court of the future. And don't worry, there'll be nothing to kill for, nothing to die for, no religion too. Which also, guys, really... which means nothing to love, right? I'll tell you right now, there are many things I would die for, including my family. But don't worry, in Elric's utopia of the future, there will be nothing to die for and no reason for religion or teleology. Also imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed and hunger, a brotherhood of man. So just live in the pod, eat the bug. You will own nothing and you will be happy. So this is like Elric's vision. Elric is like Klaus Schwab's angsty younger brother, and yet I know I'm making fun of Elric's dream, but honestly, this is one of the things that makes the story, in my opinion, so interesting, is that Melniboné is a decadent, corrupt culture. The Melnibonéans are a callous, haughty, arrogant race who live for pleasure and novelty and virtually nothing else. Slavery and torture are rampant, and Elric is saying to himself, there's got to be another way. There's got to be a solution to this. And at least Elric is thinking about solutions. And he elaborates on this when he's talking to the sorcerer adventurers in Book 2. He kind of lectures them about their own culture. He says, quote, "If your people spent less time maintaining their own devalued myths about themselves and more upon studying the world as it is, I think your city would have a greater chance of surviving. As it is, the place is crumbling beneath the weight of its own degraded fictions. The legends which offer a race their sense of pride and history eventually become putrid. If Melniboné drowns, Master Sorcerer Adventurer, it will be as Karzahat drowns now. You celebrate decadence and resist reality." So that's Elric, right? He's not hiding the ball. And yet, the brilliant thing here is that if you back up and you look at Elric's actions, despite all his philosophy and his talk, if you read about Elric's life like you were reading a history book, you'd see that Elric is a morally compromised killer. He's a murderer, and he does stupid things, and he's silly and misguided half of the time. And he too succumbs to the same weaknesses as other powerful people. And so he's powerful, but he also has a tendency to be corrupt. And yet he knows that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And despite knowing this, he thinks he's fit to reshape the world according to his will. So it's all very nuanced and very fascinating. And this is not some kind of simplistic, didactic, book with a message, right? But moving on, we'll just call that our big idea segment. I'm trying to do a big idea segment each episode of iWizard. So moving on, another thing I want to praise is just the sheer number of really cool fantasy ideas that Moorcock comes up with. The slaves who paddle the battleships in Melniboné, for example, are given drugs that enable them to row with like superhuman strength. The drug does kill them after, a fortnight, but it enables them to row super fast. In the Melnibonéan court, they keep a choir of slaves surgically modified so that each one can only sing one note, but they can sing it perfectly. And so you have this choir that can essentially be played like a pipe organ, which is really just gross and fascinating. If you're slain upon the sea, for example, you end up serving Pyre, the Chaos Lord, and Tentacled Whisperer, who commanded the Chaos Fleet. So you have dead ships and dead sailors forever in this Chaos Lord's thrall. Speaking of the sea, the water elementals are really cool, especially Strasha, the Sea King. And so you have all of these gods and elementals. There's a magical ship that's built by feuding gods that can sail on land and sea. You have the Black Rune Blades, Mournblade, and Stormbringer, the Shade Gate, the Flickering Cave, the Mirror of Memories in the Sky, the Weeping Waste, the Sighing Desert. So you have all of these really cool locations and concepts. And speaking of Stormbringer, the sword, it's really cool that the sword is sort of alive. It's an artifact of chaos, and there are all these rumors about how it came to be and what it is. Some say it possesses a mind and a will. Others claim that it's a demon in disguise. Some think it is this object that's composed of the vestigial souls of all damned mortals. Many believe it's Eriuk's battle sword that can slice through the walls of the very realms of existence. Another theory says that it's but one member of an entire race in some other realm that is just currently inhabiting Elric's dimension, but it can conjure its brothers from the other realm. So all these wacky ideas that are just so creative, and just I really enjoyed Elric's adventures in Book 2 with Una, the Dream Thief, and the Dream Worlds, the Meridor Gate, and the caverns, and the rivers of silver and molten gold, and all of that stuff. The 7 Dreamlands that you have to travel through to find the Holy Girl's prison and save the girl. Without further ado, let's get into a little bit of what I didn't like. So there may be some minor spoilers here at the end, but I feel like I really have to say a few things in order to explain what I didn't like. So the ending of Book 1 is really well executed and satisfying, but also simultaneously frustrating. Elric seems to believe that he can just reinvent morality tabula rasa. His ambition is to do good in the world by ruling Melniboné. It's not about preserving a certain way of life or heritage. It doesn't seem to be about freedom or liberty. It doesn't even seem to be about order. It's not about valor or honor or abundance or family formation. At the end, and I'm just going to give a brief 15-second spoiler warning here, and so cover your ears if you don't want to hear this. At the end of Book 1, Elric seems to believe that it's his job not to rule, not to bring order or justice or balance or fertility to the homeland like most rulers, but instead he feels like he needs to forgive his enemy and show mercy to the person who actively wants to kill him, which sounds Christian, but in this case is extremely naive. He decides to put Irkun in charge, and Irkun is a cruel, horrible, brutal, miserable bastard. And Elric decides, I'm going to forgive my enemy, I'm going to put Irkun in charge, and I'm going to go on a tour of the other countries to see if they have better ideas that I could bring back to Melniboné to make Melniboné a more moral place and a force for good in the world. So I'm going to abandon my culture and my civilization. I'm going to learn from other cultures, and I'm going to bring back their best ideas, and I'm going to use those to run Melniboné. And so this is quite silly, not only from a historical perspective, but from a political and philosophical perspective. Elric clearly sees himself as a citizen of the world, and as such, I don't simultaneously see how he can be a transient wanderer and a citizen of the world, but also be a competent, bold ruler for his own people. Another small irritation for me is the sheer number of times that Elric gets in trouble simply by running out of the medicine that keeps him alive and keeps him animate. It's one of the plot devices that Moorcock uses over and over again. Elric is on some mission, and oh shoot, he runs out of his medicine and begins to weaken slowly, and will he get back in time? And so this worked on me the first time, and it probably even worked on me the second time, but by the third time that this happened to Elric, I was just thinking to myself, why doesn't this dude just bring a large supply of medicine wherever he goes so this doesn't have to happen? So that's a minor issue. It's like reading some novel where the person has diabetes or heart problems and he keeps going places and getting stuck there for longer than he expects, and then the plot suddenly becomes about will he be able to get his medicine in time? So that was a little irksome for me. Another thing I want to say in critique is I feel overall there's just too much going on in this book. Too much action, too much travel, too much novelty, too much magic and sorcery and other realms, too many fights and missions and villains, and not enough of a sense of character building or secondary characters, or a feeling that it's all really going somewhere and that it's building towards something. Just, you have all of these isolated stories that are entertaining and novel in and of themselves, but ultimately feel a bit ephemeral, I think, at the end of the day. So I'm going to stop there. There are probably plenty of other things that I could mention or bring up. I really enjoyed this overall. 4 solid novels. I would say the first novel, Elric of Melniboné, is definitely the best of the 4. There was so much that I really enjoyed about this. That I thought was valuable and interesting. I plan to return to the series. And the second book, again, here is Stormbringer. So that would be the next thing to dive into. So without further ado, I'm going to stop us there. We are over time. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please feel free to follow us on Facebook, Goodreads, and feel free to tip your starving booktuber on Patreon. And until next time, happy reading, guys.